Well, Debussy is a phenomenal figure for us in the piano repertoire, performance, and literature that he contributed so much to us, and it's a very special world. I've always been intrigued by Debussy, and especially because he is such a pianistic composer as opposed to, let's say, Ravel, who is much more orchestral in thinking. So we always feel, as I do, that Debussy's pianism as such really is to me an extension of Chopin. And many, I think, of the influences of what Chopin was doing, an extension of sound, must have intrigued Debussy, from my feeling of working with him at the keyboard. Particularly a far-reaching piece, which was probably composed 50 years ahead of its time, the Polonaise Fantasy of Chopin. And it's an opus like 60-something. The diffusion or effusion of long harmonies on basses with pedaling, I think, is a tremendous forward reach, that many harmonies can be floated over the last bass. And I think that's kind of the feeling I get with Debussy, which is, to me, an extension of sound and atmosphere, resonance, overtones. And this is not that it wasn't experimented with earlier, even late Beethoven holding autograph pedals over harmonies that were never thought to be put together. We could even go back that far. And there's certainly other examples, perhaps in Schubert, somewhat Mendelssohn, but if I go back before Chopin, I would mention Beethoven, although he was very orchestral in thinking. The break for me with the classical school is basically a longer line and the extension of harmony over the bar, and in fact over many bars. There are even pieces of Debussy that I'm thinking of, Voile from the first book, which basically requires maybe 3 or 4 changes of pedal in the whole work. It's very unique. In the first book, that deals with the pedal point of B flat, which is part of the whole tone scale, and that he ties the same note enharmonically as A sharp, I believe, in the middle section sort of Voile, and it's the same common tone to the pentatonic scale. So the atmosphere is a continuous feeling, and the entrance into Debussy might be very well studied first with Voile, as opposed to the usual first pieces that students do, which could be Reverie or La Plus qui Lent or Valse Romantique or even the arabesques, are basically not that simple, and one has to have the feeling of a very special sound that originates from the piano in terms of Debussy, and that is a kind of floating, ethereal sound. And it's not to say that Debussy is restricted to this kind of pianism. More, there's so many different aspects of his writing for piano. It just gets more complex, as perhaps in the second book of Preludes, which is the distinction between the first and the second, is that the second book is already written in 3 staves, and that to me is already forward-looking again for our contemporary composers, who even used two bass clefs and two treble clefs. But contemporary composers who were fascinated by this, like maybe Della Gioia, and many others, have used different colorings and extensions, so he was extremely forward-looking in that sense. When I was studying Debussy throughout my childhood and at Juilliard, and performed it many times in concert, not just the preludes, Image, Stamp, pour le piano. I've studied a great deal of works of Debussy. The fiery element, if you want to call it that, exists in Fireworks, the last prelude of Book 2. Also extension of sound, or like what the West Wind saw, which is considered the more virtuoso prelude out of the first book. What is interesting to me, especially and for teachers and for students, is that there's very little actual pedal marks written by Debussy himself that gives you the author's own context of what he wanted, especially in a composer that deals with so much color and so much nuance. It seems always baffling to us why more original pedal markings were not written. And I think that would have solved many problems for students who don't understand that longer pedals could work, indicated by the last bass notes or chords in the left hand that sustain the mood and the sound in the right hand, where many harmonies could mix together. And of course it depends on the register, on the dynamic level that he has, and other indications. So you have to be a little bit more sophisticated to have a strong knowledge of harmony, structure, solfege, whatever you want to call, counterpoint that comes into play, which is based on a musical decision, not just haphazardly by, well, I'll do this or I'll do that, and it doesn't make much sense in the context of the atmosphere of the piece. The more, what should I say, far-reaching writing beyond voile and, Fireworks and What the West Wind Saw exist in the etudes. And the etudes, to me, are the pinnacle of the writing of Debussy in a very advanced stage. Naturally, everybody had to write etudes or toccatas, and of course those exist in his piano works as well. The etude as a fascination, not just as a study, but as a great work of art, are really very treacherous in Debussy. And to me, they're another bridge in the linkage of etude writing from Chopin to Liszt, who transcended the complications of the etude, to Debussy, and later, of course, Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, Prokofiev, Bartók, Stravinsky, even Ligeti today, the influence of the piano writing on Messiaen, probably, and he's, to me, the most accessible of that era of French composers. And it's very hard for a student to get into what the world of Ravel is, but it's actually easier through Debussy, and not so easy with Fauré, who's kind of, to me, the neglected one of the three. And many students hardly know anything about Fauré, who wrote a lot of beautiful piano works, but you have to have some basis with Debussy, and I think the stepping stone is either through pieces like maybe Children's Corner Suite. And it's not simple to play, even though it sounds like it's a piece for children or a child. But Pour le Piano's not easy. Estampe is treacherous. And when you think of a piece like Pagode, which is in Estampe, I mean, most of the piece is in piano and pianissimo, gliding over the keys. So you learn a great deal about the ability to float the sound and play with the arms higher up, which gives a more atmospheric, ethereal feeling and not as grounded. I remember when I was studying at Juilliard and the controversial pianist Walter Giesecke came to New York because of his wartime activities. First he was banned, then he was allowed, and there was huge demonstrations about even should we listen to him. I went anyhow, and was difficult to get in, but this was in Carnegie Hall. And I had grown up listening to recordings of his, but what mesmerized me is, though he was rather overweight and big, the ability of what the sound is that he produced amazed me, because it felt like he was hardly moving fingers on the keyboard. It was like he was not even in touch with the keys. And it was a strange mystery of where did the sound come from, which floated out into the hall. And that's strange, because it was a feeling like the sound emanated from inside the piano and went directly to the audience. So between the performer and the audience, it was like the sound was floating out through the piano. To me, what was unusual is that I think it was from Alsace-Lorraine, whether it was French or German, he was, of course, to me, more German than French, is that a German was performing French music. And I've been intrigued by pianists who had very interesting effects and coloration in Debussy. I could name Samson Francois, Jean-Yves Thibaudet today, Jean-Philippe Collard, Pascal Roger, a host of past pianists, Jacques Février, the other schoolings in France, Yves Nat, Ciampi, I think, I'm trying to think of, Perlmutter. I heard Casadessus play, which was the father, Robert Casadessus. Very kind of cool approach, I recall. And the varying things with these pianists, to me, was either a more use of the pedal or less use of the pedal, which of course changes the atmosphere dramatically, and it gives it either a more classical flavor and the absence of the etherealness that I'm speaking of, or others whose color range was even splashier, in terms of that the colors were more vibrant and more present, let's put it that way, as opposed to letting sound float and mixing sounds. Whether, I'm sure a lot of this had to do with his living in Paris and in the environs and the beauty of the countryside and the lighting that occurs, whether it's mixture of colors as you go in the countryside of France, or I think this had a lot of influence in him, incorporating the sounds of faraway places that he may not have visited, and it could have been attributed to the influence of many influences. The Far East, the South Pacific, the influence of jazz, the dance fads at the time, incorporating rhythms like Gollywog's Cakewalk, General Levine Excentrique, the humorful kind of Debussy is quite different, and so it's easy to perform and study varying styles of the composer, that it's not just generally ethereal or atmospheric. There's some that are very pointed, and for that reason highly rhythmic, and therefore actually less pedal, because to hear a lot of these rhythms it could be clouded by too much pedal, so you lose the incisiveness of the rhythmic aspect. To me, he's one of the most important composers for pianists to study. In my experience in teaching it, I always get a very negative response from a student. I see no Debussy, or really French Impressionism music, if you call it, in your repertoire, and I think we need to study them. And my immediate answer from the students is, I don't like it. And I said, did you study anything of this? No. So how can you make a judgment on works that you have no familiarity? And of course the next answer is, well, it sounds too wishy-washy. That's the typical answer, meaning, I don't know where the piece is, I don't know where it's going, I can't make any sense out of it. And that could be true if you forget where the pulses are. And to have an underlying feeling of the pulse, or especially when it's syncopated, is very important. There are other kinds of diffused kind of pieces by other composers that suffer from the same problem. I'm thinking of, let's say, Scriabin, especially a little later than early to middle, and especially late, the mixture of sounds, who was also influenced by Chopin very greatly, like Debussy. So you have a kind of French influence from a composer who was basically Polish, Chopin, and a late Romantic Russian. Much more, I feel, is this question of sound in Scriabin rather than Rachmaninoff, and that already is a big difference, in which the two could be very confusing, and not so much Tchaikovsky at all. I feel the change in the Romanticism, because don't forget we have a late German Romantic around as Brahms, and all kinds of things are going on. 12th tone, Schoenberg, jazz, all kinds of influences, getting away from a key signature, getting away from a meter, getting away from bar lines, from being kind of let loose without much structure. Yet there is structure. So he's a very pivotal composer for us, in which I call it one of the Bibles of the piano literature. Yes, you have to know Bach preludes and fugues, and you have to know Beethoven sonatas and Chopin style and nocturnes or etudes or whichever, or mazurkas. Of course, Schumann or Brahms, Liszt. You cannot avoid Debussy, or Ravel for that matter. As I pointed out, late Russian romantics too. So one has to understand where he was coming from, where was he going in terms of composers. I feel are always influenced by what preceded them, what did they accumulate and shape the music that's yet coming after them. Um, if Liszt lived longer, we look at the pieces of late Liszt and you think, my goodness, strange harmonies, very chromatic, peddling questions. Late Liszt, if he lived longer, could have made a tremendously more critical impact on what was being written for the piano. So I can't exclude that. You have great operatic figures around, and the controversy between pro-Wagner, not Wagner, Richard Strauss, symphonic composers, Mahler, Bruckner, the art song, Hugo Wolf, or tracing the art song, even the leader earlier from Schubert, Schumann. One has to have a larger gamut to understand how important he is for us in the piano literature, repertoire, performance. I always feel it's very gratifying to play Debussy. I enjoy it very much. And I think you need a special sensitivity to the world of Debussy. If it's too perfumed, it doesn't come across. If it's too real, that doesn't work either. It's a delicate balance which requires a great arsenal of technique in terms of not how fast you play, but in the movements at the piano, the choreography aspect, whether you're imitating the sounds of sunken cathedral, of a church, of resonance, of bells, of water images, reflections in the water, or the more treacherous Jadot by Ravel, or harp-like sounds. So how do you do these, and what is the touch, and what is the hand position, which has to change because you're looking for different aspects of coloring. And if you don't have enough imagination based on a solid technical foundation and different kinds of touches, then this music will evade you. In fact, it'll evade you in a lot of other repertoire, because you cannot play the piano with one hand position. You cannot approach Debussy that it's the same as obviously Beethoven or Mozart, or I'm being silly, but I'm saying that pianists don't understand that each composer has his own profile. And as we are human beings, we all are different. And we have to understand the time in which these composers lived, where did they come from, where were they going, and we can't approach them the same way mentally, physically, and the pianism required to play them requires a great deal of imagination, as I said, and not be stuck really to the printed page. You have to kind of deal with what I call waves of sound. It's not notey. It's not, a wave is what it is. I mean, you watch a wave at the ocean and it's made up of gazillion, trillion tons of little drops of water. Well, these waves of sound in Debussy and its use in other composers is, to me, anti-notey kind of writing. It's not digital in that sense. To produce sounds of the harp, producing sounds of water images, when I studied with Madame Levine at Juilliard, she was very fond of Debussy and shared many insights and thoughts as to what would give a very successful performance of this special area of music and its place and importance for us as pianists in the piano repertoire. So she always stressed the choreographic, the athleticism in performing it, which means using the right movements and muscles to gain what are you hearing. Because don't forget, as performers, we're translating black notes on a white page and we have to bring them alive. Well, to bring them alive, how do you do that? And as I mentioned, you need a tremendous amount of things that have to come together simultaneously, which means obviously a firm technical foundation. Two, an understanding of the palette of colors that you hear. Now, if you don't hear it in your inner ear to begin with, how are you going to get the sound you're looking for? So we produce the sounds that we hear inside of us. And if we're happy with what we have, then we're not going to change anything. If we're not happy and we're looking for a special sound, especially in this music, how are we going to do it? How will it project to the audience? That you have to be convinced of doing it. And there's no one way of playing the piano. I mentioned several different kinds of pianists. Cortot, or whoever you wish to name, Michelangelo, Rubinstein, Horowitz, I can go on and on and on. Everyone had special qualities of their personality to bring to bear on the music. And our job, of course, is to study it, absorb it, and not copy it. And see what is the influence that these people have on the music, or non-influence. I don't think everyone can play everything. I never believed that. Pianists make their niche in various repertoires, and when they cross over to an area they don't feel as comfortable, then the results are staggeringly bad in terms of, I will try something and let's see how it goes. Meanwhile, I've made a career, so nobody's going to criticize me because my reputation has already been formed. That's not true. You're crossing the concert stage, or as a teacher, you have to be very convinced of the repertoire, constantly keeping an open mind on not excluding performing composers, and having a broader view to the repertoire. What we make our career later is where our affinity lies towards the music. And so big careers have been made on specialized maybe areas of the repertoire. Unfortunately, competitions have pushed us into that we have to be a master of everything, which means we're a master of nothing, because we have to play everything pre-Bach up to contemporary, and chamber music, and solo with the orchestra as a concerto, and be a wonderful sight reader, and all kinds of tests we have to jump through. And it's impossible for one human being to do all of this. So after studying a lot of the repertoire, then you can decide, at this point in time, this is the area or areas I wish to concentrate in, and build the programs accordingly. Can you make a career without Debussy? I suppose so. You can make a career without any of the composers in that sense. But having studied them well, and then seeing which of these pieces by those composers feels good to you. And it doesn't mean all the pieces, let's say we're talking about Debussy, means those are the ones you're going to perform, because there may be aspects of his writing that you are not taken with. That doesn't mean every work by every major composer is a gold mine. There are pieces by the major composers that I would never program because I'm not convinced of them. And I've studied them, and there's no necessity to play things you really don't love. There's enough by major composers and minor composers, for that matter, that will draw our attention anyhow. And so, since our piano literature is so vast, there's got to be something in there for somebody. And we have a, fortunately, huge repertoire to deal with. And since the piano is such an accessible instrument where everybody can play it, that doesn't mean that all of us are going to be pianists, and it doesn't mean just by playing a key without any relationship to how do you produce the sound and what are you doing is not usually addressed. When we say the pianism of playing Debussy, for instance, it's the feeling of how it lies in the hand and in the terrain of the keyboard. And that is what we call pianistically gratifying. Not that every single note of Debussy is so gratifying to play. The basic amount of his repertoire is, and I feel it's strongly related to Chopin, because Chopin is also a very gratifying composer to play, and therefore a lot of Liszt's are composers who really understood the piano and write well for it, even though it may not in first study appear that they lie well. It also is in terms of the language. What keys were they written in? Why was a key written for a particular piece of Debussy, let's say, or other composers, is because they were looking at it with special moods and special coloring, actually, and that's the key word, the coloring. If the piece is in B flat and not A sharp, and in what key is the B flat, like I mentioned in Vol, and how is its function tied to the piece? These are overall arches of pedal points that keep the pieces together, and therefore the use of the pedal. So you do, as I mentioned before, have to have an understanding of harmony, of structure, of knowing what you're doing at the piano. So it may appear easy to do, and yet it's rather complicated, because underneath that are many layers of things to work with at the keyboard until this all comes together. Making jagged motions or jumping across the piano when the mood is quiet and serene breaks the mood of the piece, even before you start and even when you end the piece. Its totality has a shape, and that is what you're thinking about, which is called the architecture of the piece. Not just what's on the printed page. It goes beyond that. It's, as I mentioned, it's before you start the piece and when you end the piece. All of that is one line. Underneath that are separate inner phrases that make up the longer phrase. And the longest phrase of the piece is what I mentioned, the piece in its totality. And one has to see beyond that when you're working on a piece. Otherwise, the piece will never come across. It is what I call meandering through it. I like this chord, I'll take a little time. Debussy writes many markings for us. Please move ahead. He doesn't say please. Get a little faster, get a little slower, a little more animated, a little less animated, slow down, pick up. You have to be able to maneuver keeping the piece together, which is dealing with time. And time is rubato. And he writes, like, even in the beginning of Reflections, with rubato. And composers have used this before, and we really have to pay attention. What is the stealing of time, and when is the giving back of time? If we take too much time, the piece falls apart. If we don't take enough time, it has no fluidity or plasticity or liquidity. All these words like that, fluidity, fluid, harp-like, watery, give you certain images that we have to play based on large strokes of gestures, of impulses, which are all other words for long phrasing. The usage of res in Debussy. Are they covered with the pedal or they're not? And so we have to experiment with sound. Is this was the intent of the composer or wasn't it? And you can experiment with that in your practicing, going beyond, what should I say, learning the right notes and the right rhythms and knowing where everything falls, and then the imagination beyond that, which is really not just in Debussy, but requires us in the practice. I would say the learning of the piece is worth about 10%, finding the notes and the rhythms and getting through it and knowing the harmonies. The 90% of the polish goes into the areas of all the details and nuance, the voicing of a chord, the textures I'm dealing with, the right fingering, what helps the passage stay together, where I play it on the keyboard, how does it feel in my body, the usage, not just the finger technique, which is brutal. Your fingers are tied to your body and you play with your whole body. You need all these aspects to play Debussy, as you do in other composers, but particularly those that deal with the full gamut of expressions at the keyboard, and I mean the whole keyboard, not just centered around middle C. You're covering a great amount of territory, and you have to feel very comfortable in playing this. Not, oh my goodness, the piece is written way down here, or it's written way up there, and or at the both extremities of the piano at the same time. How do I get there? What are the arcs in getting there? Do I go across the keyboard? Do I go straight across? Do I go under the keyboard? Which direction am I going? Is it parallel motion in these compositions? Is it contrary? Is it oblique? Many students don't understand even what that means. They just play. And so just playing without a plan, whether it's Debussy or anybody else, leads to disaster. And you have no idea of where you're going and what you're doing. So you have to have an underpinning, especially if the piece is very diffuse, because then you're really lost. And if you don't know where the pulses are, you're further lost. So it's like somebody pulled the carpet out from under you, and so you feel very insecure. No wonder students say, I don't like it, because they don't have an underpinning in this music, where to go and what to do. And so that's why I get these answers of wishy-washy, and I don't like it, and I don't know anything, and the sound picture is all wrong. It's not the atmosphere that is associated with the piece, not because I said so, but because it's part and parcel of the nature of the work. They don't have, and one needs to, the background of the literature, of the country, its language, its customs, the paintings, which are extremely important. It's an unbelievable area for us to deal with and absorb, and the images that are created from it, so that when you get up close by, it all looks like a total blur. And when you move back a little bit, yes, that's the face of a woman, and in there is the trees, and mixed with the light is there's a little dog, and oh, look at how the river's running, and the light on the trees or the haystacks that are painted at different times of the day or the seasons. All this plays a great role in this area of music, and if one doesn't have any background to bring to it, I think today's generation doesn't even know where France is in Europe. They've made studies of geography. People don't know where anything is in the world. They don't have an understanding of the culture and all the things I mentioned. It's not just, oh, I'll put the music up on the piano and play. Well, anybody can do this. That's what I call for an average student who doesn't even get that far. And yet, they're delving into great pillars of our repertoire with not any sense of what the music is all about. I mean, what are you bringing to the piece? Not what the piece is going to bring you. What is your command of the instrument? Not that the instrument is in command of you. It becomes very lopsided, and so the study and therefore the performance obviously is highly affected by it. I guess these are some of my thoughts. I don't know if I answered all your questions or not, but
this has been great.
Hope this helps you.
This helps a great deal. If there's anything more you could say about what you see as how Debussy is a visual composer, or his music has a visual effect that...
I think it's, as I mentioned, extremely visual in the terms of, as I mentioned, your choreography of the piece, the motions and the movements, has to be timed with the nature of the music. If it's a comical kind of piece, the precision that is necessary is completely different of playing, let's say, General Levine Excentrique as opposed to playing the Sunken Cathedral. The visual has a great deal to do with the atmosphere of the piece, and I don't feel one can be separated from the other. How I'm getting there to play what I'm doing and how I go from place to place is part of the pianism. It may have been thought about in the practice of what I'm doing, and then it's supposed to look spontaneous and creative and improvisatory when I'm playing it. That's a delicate balance. I know where I'm going in the keyboard. I know what I'm doing. This is not a hit and miss situation that because it's sunny in California I play it one day, and if it's snowing in Minnesota I'll play it a different way. I feel that the study of the piece is with you for your lifetime, and it's really like putting a puzzle together. This piece fits with that piece, and if it doesn't fit, you better find out how is it going to fit. And once you figured it out and have arrived at it, it's frankly there the rest of your life. The fingering has been settled, the pedaling, I understand what I want to do. You've made building blocks, and they all fit together. And if something is amiss, the piece is never under one's hands, because anything will happen. But anything will happen which is creatively, like in Debussy, only when the basics are taken care of. You cannot, well, gee, I don't remember if he wrote forte here or pianissimo, and is it portato or detaché? Gee, I don't know. Is it legato? Gee, I didn't look at the markings too carefully. Well, you better. And a forte sound in Debussy is not the same as Mozart or in Liszt. It's within the context of the piece. So there's fortes and pianos and pianissimos. And it still all has to project. It's not a piano or a pianissimo that will evaporate and then there is no sound whatsoever. And the forte doesn't mean hit the piano as loud as you want to, because that's obviously not in the nature of this music. There's no percussiveness involved. The beauty of sound is always stressed. A lot has been said about bel canto, beautiful sound, is true, but and unfortunately our instrument is not listed like that. It's listed as a percussive instrument in the orchestra. That's the furthest thing from my mind when I'm performing or practicing at the piano or in teaching. Every sound that you're doing is you're responsible for. And it's not, well, I didn't mean that. Well, the accent was too much, and so it's like we walk around with 10 heads on our body. So this note jumps out, this is out of context. We're talking about a control of sound which is based on a control of your technique. But it's multifaceted because it could be many things. We're playing in the wrong line of the keyboard. We're playing with the elbows out, or we're producing all kinds of tension in performing. All this affects the sound, and therefore the questions of what you're asking, which deal with this ethereal light and colors and all, sounds ethereal, but underneath there's an underpinning, so we know exactly what we're doing. This is not, what I say, a hit and miss proposition. We know exactly what we're doing. And yet it has to sound spontaneous when we're performing it. That's the trick. And don't forget, there's always somebody out there who has never heard the piece and it's for the first time listening. And so that's very important. You have to believe in the product, which happens to be the piece you're playing. Otherwise, you're not going to sell it. And the listener is certainly not going to buy it. And so there's nothing really called bad music. What is bad are bad performances which give music a bad name. And so when children are coming and you're exposing them, or adults, it doesn't matter, to a first-time, quote, classical program, and if it is an inferior kind of performance, no wonder our audiences are turned off from classical music, because the fault lies in the performer. And anyone can feel that. You don't have to have a musical background to know, you know what, I didn't like it, something was wrong, I just can't put my finger on it. And the non-musician will even express it better than a musician will. Didn't sound right to me, or something. It's very apparent, not just in Debussy, but in any composer. When everything isn't put together, nothing is going to transcend the stage. So I feel, and a lot has been written about this, I'm not saying anything brand new, that the bad performances have taken a toll on our audiences, on the teaching profession, where teachers don't hear these things. Yes, our level of teaching has gotten better. Yes, we have better editions. Yes, we have better pianos. All that is added to the equation when all this has been put together. You're walking in another world, and don't forget that the role of the performer is to lift us to another planet and out of our body, so to speak, to transport us. And you're leaving this world to go somewhere else, and that's totally in the imagination of the performer. And that is a tremendous responsibility when you cross the stage. It may sound okay, may be okay in the teaching studio or in the living room. It will not sound in the concert hall. And don't forget, concert halls now are bigger and better. And in Debussy's time, there were good concert halls. But remember, you're coming from still the feeling of a salon atmosphere in Paris, of Chopin was not sitting and playing in halls of 6,000 people. Franz Liszt maybe changed the whole landscape. But if you're comparing Debussy with Chopin, you're talking about still the feeling of a salon feeling. And how is that going to project in today's concert hall? Pianists who attempt to do this then land up pushing the sound beyond its limits. Or, as I said, it'll evaporate into nothing, and so there is practically no sound. And you see the pianist playing, but you don't know what they're doing. So
That's very good. Well, you're preaching what I say a lot too, and I think this is exactly what's happened. Some artists have said that Paris has a special quality of light. Of course, it has this very special quality of culture and a sense of the history, and some of the greatest artworks in the world are there. Do you think there's anything about the light or the quality of air or something in Paris that would have influenced how Debussy's works came out?
Probably. I think it's all part of the same package. I mean, sitting in the coffee house in Paris and observing the people and the art of conversation, which is fast disappearing due to our technology and the computer age, it was a whole different aura of a relaxed, I don't know if it's relaxed, there's a kind of elegance and a quiet maturity that is lacking today. And yes, I'm sure the influence of Paris as one of the greatest cities in the world, in the gardens and to go in the squares and walking around every street is like another mystery. You're really walking in a museum, and everything is another surprise, another revelation. Of course, it's an older city, and yes, the light and moods and the clouds and the sun and or the lack thereof is of course an influence, and or in the countryside. I mean, to me that's true for almost any country. You get a different aura of light if you're in Amsterdam or in London or Moscow or St. Petersburg or Warsaw. All these cities where composers have lived obviously was an influence to them in the landscape, the mood, the life was so different. The life. Today, all these modern sounds that we're hearing affects the composers. I mean, to hear clanging, tumultuous traffic, think about the sounds that we have around us are part and parcel of today's composer's writing, as the lack thereof, I'm sure, was in Debussy's time. A quiet elegance, what's the word I'm looking for? Humbleness, empathy for people, empathy for nature, and listening. We have forgotten how to listen, and that's strange because we deal in an art of listening. Today it's either black or white. It's true or false. There's nothing in between. There's no gray areas. There's no other coloring involved. There's no nuance. What means nuances? What is the... We say read between the lines when we read something. Well, what does that mean? I mean, is there some secrets around? We all have an inner life. What is the inner life? How is that projected into music or into literature or into painting? What's the inner life? It's very subtle. It's not so revealing. That's why I term it a secret. Other composers wrote with secrets too. It's for you to unlock the secret. Composers have tried to duplicate and have successfully. If you're strolling in the garden together and you whisper something to somebody, composers have written that in smaller little notes to show that it's a secret between two people, and not necessarily to be shared. Schumann did this. It's not as evident, and you really have to look deeper into the score, not as a musicologist, and that this piece was written in 1898 under a tree in Paris and so forth. That sort of doesn't interest me in that sense. I want to know, here's a piece I'm dealing with. What is the mood of the piece, rather the character? What influences were there? And how am I going to recreate this? Because that's my role as a performer, is the recreation of somebody else's thoughts and feelings. Unless I was the composer, then I can sort of write down what I would like to say at the keyboard. Thank God I'm not a composer, because I think it would be tremendously difficult for me to do that. Or as a recreator between the composer, me, the performer, and the audience, I have a tremendous job in this troika three-way approach, which is the same threesome in performing and balancing my mind, my heart, and my fingers. If any one of these is out of joint, together with the threesome of the composer, the performer, and the audience, you're dealing with a very delicate balance of things to put in their proper equilibrium. And if one of these are out of balance, the whole thing falls apart. And that, to me, is a frustration for students who are studying it. It's hard for them to find this balance. They're also not self-critical enough. Did you really like what you played? Yeah, it was wonderful. What do you mean it was wonderful? I didn't get a message. I wasn't touched by your playing. And I have to be. Because if you're just playing a bunch of notes translated on the paper, whether it's Debussy, Scriabin, Mozart, or Bach, then what's the point of my studying the piece when I didn't get any message? You're really wasting my time. And that is the tremendous responsibility, not only as a performer, but since I've done a lot of teaching, is my job is to pull this out of a student who probably has it, what I call buried inside of them, but kind of has not tapped into it and may not even realize that it's there. And easier for the talented one to do it because they can flit across the keyboard with a very quick ease. They sight read it quickly, they learn the piece quickly, they perform it quickly, and haven't reached any depth. And actually, that's how they go through life. They don't notice anything around them. They don't care. We live in a very me-I world. It's all about me. I'm not interested in you. I'm not interested in the past. I'm barely interested in the future. How can you approach a piece with this kind of attitude? It doesn't work. And that's a tall order. Forgetting when there's so many gaps involved, they can't even pronounce the names of the composers or the pieces correctly, or any idea of all these subtleties. You have to dig deeper, and that's part of this world of Debussy, which frankly has not, I think for pianists has given it a kind of bad name, because I find it one of the most neglected areas of the repertoire. If not the most neglected, it's certainly the second area. Students I get with teachers, they're busy teaching Bach, they're doing Mozart and Beethoven and Chopin, and this and that, the classics, the romantics, the area of, quote, French Impressionism, certainly Debussy or Ravel, forget Fauré, is ignored. And to me, the other area that's ignored is the contemporary. Well, he sits in this whole area. So if we're taking these 5 areas of Baroque, Classic, Romantic, and now Impressionism, forget the 12 tone, which I can't, and contemporary, the 2 areas that are the biggest minus is French piano music and what's written today. That's like 80% or 90% of the students that I see, forgetting whether it's at the University of Southern California where I teach